Welcome, everybody. Today, my guest is Mark A. Michaels. He's a writer and conceptual artist. Mark's work examines fundamental paradigm dilemmas in both traditional psychotherapy and contemporary psychedelic therapy. Welcome, Mark. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great to meet you. I've been looking forward to this conversation. So, tell me about kind of how you grew up and what led you down the path of being interested in psychotherapy and in psychedelic therapy.
Um, well, I grew up in 1970s New York, and I was born in 1959, and we can get into my origin story a little bit if you'd like.
Yeah.
It's kind of central in a lot of ways. I was conceived by donor insemination in 1958, and it was kept secret until I was in mid-adulthood in my 30s when I figured it out. And
Wow.
I wasn't in some ways temperamentally a very good fit for my family, and so I always felt a little bit different and outside. And I think the the origin story is a big part of that. I'm also neurodivergent, so uh, I had some issues in school as a very small child and was sent to therapy at age 5 and spent most of my childhood in therapy. So I was kind of fertile ground for therapy and have had a lot of therapy in my life. The childhood therapy was in some ways very helpful and in other ways very harmful, I would say. And my neurodivergence is unusual in that it's what's currently called nonverbal learning disability. It's not in the DSM, and it has primarily to do with visual spatial uh, comprehension and thinking. I'm highly verbal, also highly gifted, so a lot of the giftedness counterbalanced it, but childhood did and school presented some difficulties. I was great at relating to adults and not so good at relating to people my own age, hence the therapy. Um,
Yeah.
and I continued to be in therapy through where I stopped at 13 and went back after college and then was in therapy for a little over a decade in the 80s and 90s, stopped again, felt that I was done with it, and had a pretty successful career as a writer and teacher with my now ex-wife. And uh, as we started exploring psychedelics together in the early 2010s, and the marriage kind of unraveled during our psychedelic work. I would say that I'd experimented with psychedelics as a teenager and felt their power then, and I'm still quite devoted to working with psychedelics now. But I've also seen a lot of pretty bad stuff in the psychedelic world, and feel that there's a lot of room for improvement there. And similarly, in as the marriage started to unravel, and there was a lot of other kind of trauma in life that happened during those years, I went back into therapy, some of it individual, some of it couple, and had overwhelmingly bad experiences in therapy during that time. And that's sort of what led me to the subject of the paper that I've written, which is this new course of therapy that I developed in collaboration with a couple of therapists that has been very beneficial. And I'm continuing to work with them, although less frequently than is discussed in my paper.
Wow. And
That's
what's
a
your paper called?
Binaries, Multitudes, and Beyond. And the subtitle is a client. I'm not going to remember the full subtitle.
Okay. No worries.
Um, and it's currently available as a preprint, and I've submitted it to a peer reviewed journal, and it's under review right now. So I'm hopeful that it will be published on a peer reviewed basis, which is kind of what my objective was with it all along.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah, so therapy in 1959 and the 80s and then today are very different, right? So
Yeah.
um, I'd love to actually hear about like some, doesn't have to be specific, but like what was going on. In my experience with therapy, there was uh, a bit of like shame and blame kind of thing happening, which wasn't actually very therapeutic. It was kind of the opposite. It was like this need to hold you accountable and get you moving in the right direction. And when you go to therapy, I don't think that's really what we're looking for. What we're really trying to do is get in touch with who we really are and what we really want and need. And we have all these society's expectations about what that's supposed to be, especially for you as a young child. Being very gifted can often mean that you're very much understood or misunderstood and asked to be much smaller than you are or much more palatable. Like if you are really good at seeing and reading people and then you're telling them things that they find unpleasant or they don't want to hear, they can get very activated, right?
Well, therapy then was, as I said, it was a really mixed bag. I mean, I had the therapist I went to was a leading guy in the child therapy department at the time, and was, as pretty much everyone was then, coming out of one form or another of psychoanalytic thought. And a lot of what we did early on was play therapy, and so just doing games and stuff like that. But that was a vehicle also for talking about whatever was troubling me. And I was going once a week. And I think that I did develop a lot of self-awareness in that, it was 8 years of working with him. And, as I got a little bit older, it started being more talk therapy than play therapy. But there was definitely an element of kind of making me socially acceptable in it. And also, unfortunately, I mean, my mother was very devoted to her own therapy. And the guy that I was going to was a close colleague of her therapist. And she was, I think, also gifted and also, quite troubled in a lot of ways and had her own pretty severe traumas to deal with. And she could be quite controlling. And years later, I went back to the therapist and tried to untangle some of the things that I felt had been really harmful in the work that I had done with him. And the main thing that I remember him saying to me, and this was when I was in my probably around 30 when I went to see him, and he was retired and but remembered well. And he said, "What I really was trying to do for you was create a space where your mother was not in the room, and to give you uh, a little bit more freedom and autonomy than you had elsewhere." I don't know whether he succeeded very well at that, but I do feel that um, this the self-awareness that I got from it, and some of the things that I learned in terms of self-regulation were important and you know probably life-saving in some ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And with the artificial insemination, was there a father figure in your life or not during
Yes,
that?
I mean at the time that this was done, it was only available to married couples, and they also didn't. There were no sperm banks, so they would have a medical student or resident kind of in the next room providing a sample right before the insemination was performed. And the advice was keep it a secret, no one will know, and you'll forget about it eventually.
Interesting.
Um, And on top of that, they, in my case, and it was not uncommon, they mixed the samples and told the um, told the parents that this would increase the likelihood of fertilization happening. So, but with the ostensible father's sperm. So there was this whole layer of deception that was
Yeah.
embedded in it, and it so much so that I mean, when I did eventually figure it out and confront my parents, and they confirmed it. Um, Years later, my mother said, "Your father had colon cancer. You really should stay on top of that.
Hmm.
Like, get a regular colonoscopy." So she had gone back to denying that there was a donor involved.
Wow. Wow. Okay.
Um, but I always felt there was something not quite right. I always felt like it didn't fit in a little bit. My family of origin, or non-biological father and mother, are both Jewish. And apparently by accident, the donor was not Jewish. And that's how I ended up. That facilitated my finding him many years later.
Okay.
Uh, because Jewish DNA, because the population of Jews in Europe was reduced to 150 in the 15th century, and there's a tradition of cousin marriage in Jewish communities. So all European Jews will test as being fairly closely related. But I was able to separate out the non-Jewish side from the Jewish side, and thereby figure out who the biological father was, because I knew where the procedure had been done, and I got enough information about the likely pool of candidates that I could narrow it down.
Wow. Wow. And was finding that out traumatic for you?
Um, yes and no. I mean, when I did eventually meet, tell my parents that this was what I suspected, and they confirmed it, it caused a real rupture with them. And my desire to find the donor was utterly unacceptable to my mother. And we did eventually repair it, but I never revealed that I had found him. I basically searched in secret. Um, it was much harder for her to deal with, I think, than for my father, actually. And they both they both died a couple of years ago, and I really kind of regret that I couldn't tell my father, hey, I did actually find, and donor's not a good word because they're actually paid for this, their
Oh,
bodily
right.
fluid. It's not a donation. It's a paid process, and it still is. So there's a euphemism there. But I feel that my my non-biological father would have been happy to know that I had found my biological father, and that it didn't change anything in my feelings for him. Uh, so I still have a lot of sadness around that
Yeah.
aspect of it. But the trauma was only in how it was received, not in having the knowledge. In fact, having the knowledge gave me a kind of clarity that had been missing, and so it was very healing for me to learn the truth.
Yeah. That makes sense. How did you find out that you even needed to look down that road?
Uh, I had spent many years kind of trying to figure out what was going on, because there's a 13-year gap between my older half sister and me. And uh, my father's father had died a few months before I was conceived. And so I kind of had this hypothesis that, as with adoption, sometimes when people adopt a kid, all of a sudden they're able to conceive. It's not that unusual. So I thought maybe there was kind of a psychological component to this.
Mhm.
Um, but I was talking about it with my sister one day, and she said, well, I always suspected that this is what happened, but nobody ever talked about it. And I kind of filed that away. And a couple of years later, there was a kind of a crisis, and the family was seeing in various configurations of family therapist. And I was with my first wife at the time, and we were talking about these issues. And my first wife said, well, why don't you tell her what you really think? And I did. And she then said, I think that's probably right, or I suspect that's probably right. And she proceeded to explain kind of how the process was done at the time. Her husband had been a donor, was a doctor, and so she was very familiar with what was done in the 1950s. And I then checked. My mother kept her calendars for years, so I was able to check her calendar for 1958, and I saw that she had been in New Haven on the day that right around the time when I would have been conceived. So that was sort of the confirmation that I needed. And it took me a couple of months to screw up the courage, but I finally went and asked. And they then did confirm it, and my mother was quite distraught that I had brought it up.
Yeah. Wow. So now you have this history of going to psychotherapy, and then you said in your teen years you experienced the power of psychedelics. I dabbled a little bit, but I had no idea what I was doing. It wasn't with intention, and I only tried it. I think I tried mushrooms like once, and then I did have an experience with uh, acid where I was given a sugar cube that was drenched in it, basically. I was
Yeah.
told there were 7 hits of acid on it. I don't know if it was even the real thing or, but I definitely had a psychedelic experience and I did not enjoy it. But I had no idea what I was walking into, and I was not in a safe environment. And so you've spoken about how psychedelic therapy can go very wrong. And when a person is not intending to have a psychedelic experience and they're not in a safe environment, those are 2 factors that can make it go very wrong. I'd like to know like your experience with it as a teen and then with intention later in life.
Yeah, I mean, the safe environment is key, and what that means is not always easy to tell in advance. And I was in journey groups that were not at all safe environments for me, even though the ostensible purpose was growth and healing and self and awareness. Group dynamics can be really messy.
Yeah.
And so safety is a really variable thing. When I was first experimenting at 13, and it was the early 70s, the first few times I did it, I was at home and alone, um, and that was wonderful. And I was exploring it deliberately uh, with this, with that kind of early 70s sense of I wanted to have mystical experiences. I wanted something transcendent. It wasn't like, oh, taking drugs, getting high, escaping. It was really a kind of spiritual quest, even at 13. Uh, then I did it in school once, which was really stupid, but kind of funny in retrospect, because I was in ninth grade and I was really bad at Latin. And I dropped acid late in the day, and Latin class was the last class of the day. and I'm in the class just tripping my brains out. And at the end of the class, the teacher calls me up and says, "Mark, I don't know what you did today, but you were so good in class."
Yeah.
Um, so somehow it must have improved my Latin skills for a few hours. But
Yeah, I
uh,
do notice my brain works, I get more analytical, I have more cognition when I try acid now, and I'm actually trying to get away from that. I'm trying to be less analytical. So that makes a lot of sense.
but then the really stupid thing, and the last time I did it until college, when I did it again to see if I could handle it, was that I very foolishly went to the Ziegfeld Theater in New York City, where the revival of 2001 in like remastered Dolby sound was showing. And I had bought some window pane acid from a friend, and he said, "Only take half." And I couldn't tear it in half, so I just took the whole thing.
Oh,
And I'm by myself in New York City at 14, and you can just imagine how terrifying that was.
yeah, yeah.
And then I got home and called a friend, and we talked for 15 minutes about the usual kind of ninth grade girl problems and stuff. And I said, "Listen, man, I'm having a bad trip. You got to help me." He goes, "Oh, really? I couldn't tell." And so then for the next, I don't know, 8 or 10 hours, I was convinced that I was going to be locked in my brain this way forever. It was
Mm,
terrifying. But
yeah,
I still go back to that terrifying trip, and there's gold in it, 50 years later. So even the kind of terrifying experiences can have value, but not doing it in a safe environment is unwise. Um, and again, what's safe really depends a lot on the circumstances
yeah,
and the people you're
absolutely.
with.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting to think about, like, sometimes people think that having a psychedelic experience or journeying with their very close friends is a good idea, and it isn't always, because of relationship dynamics. I mean, when we think about life as a mirror of our internal experience with ourselves, and then we have that, these people in our lives are reflecting back to us the way that we're treating ourselves, essentially. Um, we might have a lot of close friends that we are kind of trauma bonded with, that are not able to hold a container that is objective. Like, they'll have agendas for each other. They'll have jealousies over each other. They'll have, and that can be very harmful, especially when you're opening up to a mystical experience.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, I don't want to go into too many details about the my recent marriage, but we had a very regular ketamine practice together, and I think it held us together in ways and really pulled us apart in ways. And I still work regularly with ketamine, both in therapy and on my own with a prescription and supervision. I'm not doing it underground at all or recreationally. And a lot of what, the practice that my ex and I developed together has continued in my own solo practice. So there was great value in it, but I also feel that it was hugely destructive in terms of what ended up happening in the marriage. So it's really complicated.
Yeah. What would you say are some ways that opening up to these experiences in intimate partnership can be beneficial and destructive?
Well, I mean, I'm not a big fan of I let me stop. I don't want to say who I'm not a big fan of, but there's a term, non-specific amplifiers for psychedelics, which I think is a very, very useful term to think about. So the idea is that psychedelics will amplify whatever is going on in a room or in a dynamic. And I think that unfortunately, if there are issues in a marriage, in a relationship, psychedelics can really amplify those, especially if the outside environment, and in my case that it would include psychedelic therapists in some instances, is undermining or not safe or not helpful in some way. And so, or journey groups for that matter. And you know what happened, without going into a whole lot of detail, is that the journey groups were not safe environments for me, and they were for her
Mm.
by and large. And so that ended up creating a lot of friction and doing a lot of damage.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Uh, Safe for you versus safe for her. Like when it comes, I imagine with these journey groups, you know, psychedelics are not, psychedelic therapy is not exactly mainstream. You don't have lots of people to choose from um, for your groups, right? And we have to remember that every human is a human, whether they're a therapist or a space holder, retreat facilitator. Um, they're still human and they still have their own traumas, whether they're capital T or lowercase t. Um, they have emotions, they have agendas, they have sensations in their bodies, they have desires, and they have things that they are disgusted by. And when we are trusting we can't always trust a therapist implicitly. We have to remain aware of the fact that they're a human and that they have all the same things going on within them that we have within ourselves.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, my experience with groups and with therapists, uh, generally speaking, I've found that traditional or somewhat traditional shamans with training with a ritual container where there's not a lot of psychology involved tend to be safer than informal journey groups or kind of Western therapy oriented or healing oriented people who've maybe had some shamanic training. I think that's really where kind of you get into big time trouble. I mean, there have definitely been problems with traditionally trained shamans as well, but in terms of the container and the general safety of the group, I think that the ritual, even if it does, even if it's not culturally ours, that container can create a lot more safety.
I could see that because a traditionally trained shaman is really there to have one foot here and one foot across the veil, and they're just having the experience and they're holding the container where they allow everybody to have their own experience, where they're not trying to influence each individual's experience. In Western culture, a lot of us who are studying therapy or wanting to facilitate psychedelic therapy are rescuers. You know, we're trying to heal our own trauma by changing the way other people behave. So we go into it as a therapist, and what we're really doing is trying to create our own sense of safety within our own body by gathering other people to make us feel safe and behave in a way that we want them to. So they won't allow the individuals to have their own journey. They'll be, mixing in their stuff with it. And then, we have the share circle afterward. I facilitate share circles without psychedelics here locally. And the most challenging part of it is for people to not give each other feedback, to not
Mm-hmm.
comment, to not try to give them advice, to not try to fix them. They're all so excited to jump in with their advice and their wisdom. And it's like, we're not doing this for that. We're not doing this to we're here to learn how to express and be seen in that without judgment and comment afterward. And it's really hard for my groups to grasp that. And
Yeah.
they're trying to now facilitate on their own. And I'm just gonna watch and be like, okay, you do your thing, but I don't think you're really understanding what we're trying to achieve here.
Yeah. I mean, I actually did do a psychedelic therapy facilitator training. Didn't complete it, partly because of the marriage falling apart. But I was pretty clear by halfway through that I had no interest in sitting for other people, and I think that um, it takes a really special person to be able to handle that and to do it well, and not get into people's heads in a counterproductive way. I think it's rare. Uh, I really have come to feel that the EMDR ketamine combination is optimal for psychedelic therapy work, um, because it's focused, it's tailored, and it's dealing directly with whatever's coming up for the client. And it's a lot harder in that framework for external stuff to get dragged in on the therapist side. And I think I've experienced more benefit from ketamine EMDR than in terms of sort of healing, if you want to, if you want to use that term, uh, addressing these kind of deeper issues. It's really been the most effective, and that was a core part of the treatment program that I've described in the paper, and is sort of the most recent iteration of what I've been doing.
Okay.
That in conjunction with MDMA, psilocybin, and a MAPS trained sitter, but the core of it has really been the ketamine EMDR therapy, and then my at home ketamine practice, which now is often more kind of artistic and creatively oriented than therapeutically oriented.
Hmm, that's cool. Like the EMDR ketamine combination is, you're saying it's more difficult for transference to happen, right?
Well, get me on transference. I think that transference is let's say it's important to be aware of, but I think it can become a catch-all. And I think that what's really important is countertransference.
Can you
And that
describe that?
countertransference is what the therapist projects onto the client. And I think overwhelmingly, in my experience, therapists don't pay anywhere near enough attention to that. And it's really easy for therapists to go, oh, that's transference. It may or may not be transference. Um, but as a therapist, you damn sure better be aware of your countertransference and be
Absolutely.
really careful with it, because that's where the harm happens, usually, is
Yeah.
in the countertransference.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting, even in just partnership in my relationship. Uh, I'll I'll notice, I'll be like, oh, he's projecting, and then the minute I have that thought, I'm like, okay, so then that means I'm projecting. So, right? If life is a mirror, you're getting
Yeah,
what you're
yeah.
giving. So if you don't, you have to watch yourself in those scenarios.
But I think the difference, and the really key difference, and this relates to one of the core themes in the paper, is that where there's a real power differential, where the therapist is in the role of the one who knows and the one who's going to show the client their truth, or what, whatever, however you want to characterize it, there is this power imbalance. even though the therapist is being paid by the client or the insurance company or whatever, the therapist is really in a position of power and authority. And they really need to be aware of their projections because they can do harm. And the client, maybe it's transference, maybe it's not. This is something that's just came up for me, and I'm I don't want to get into too much detail about it, but something can easily be labeled transference when it's really not transference at all. It's really about what's going on in the moment, in the relational dynamic. And it's easy for a therapist to say, oh, that's transference. But, it's really like, look at yourself, therapist, because if you're in that authority position and you're making that interpretation, you're telling the client how they're perceiving things and feeling. And you may be wrong.
Yeah. Can you give an example of like a general, it doesn't need to be a personal example, but like a scenario in which a person might like a story, a situation a person is talking to their therapist about, and the therapist might say that's transference, so that people know.
Um, okay, well, I can give you kind of an example drawn on life experience, not a recent one, but I had a therapist many years ago who um, repeatedly showed up late, who snored multiple times during our session. I was on the couch. It was, Freudian. I'd catch him snoring. He would deny it. Um, he finally missed a session altogether. I was living in Hell's Kitchen on 34th Street on the far west side of Manhattan. His office was on 93rd and Madison. And our sessions were at like 8 in the morning. So I would be busting my ass to get uptown, across and uptown to see him. And this day he doesn't show up. And he doesn't call me until like way late in the afternoon or the next day. I don't remember, but it was a long time. Nothing. He wants to go, and I'm like, okay, I'm done. This is enough. I mean, there was also an episode where I was talking about some sexual stuff, and I felt that he was being very prurient in the way he was asking me questions. And I called him out on it. He, of course, denied it. When I finally have had enough and I want to end the treatment, he's like, let's go mediate this with my supervisor. I'm like, hell no.
Yeah.
How much am I supposed to take here?
Right.
And, I'm sure that in his mind or in his justification of his behavior, he would ascribe all of my reactions as transferential. But it's like, no, you're being an asshole. You're treating me like I have no value.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not transference here. It's just basic human decency.
Right.
And it's honesty. It's like, I heard you snore. Don't tell me you didn't. Not just once, but multiple times.
Yeah. And the thing in that scenario is you wouldn't have called him out on it if it was you, like if it was coming from you and it was just you having low self-worth or you projecting that onto him. You would have just kept taking it if that was the case.
Yeah. So, I mean, transference can be just this wall that therapists can hide behind. And it's one of the points that I feel is central in the paper is therapists should be sharing their power. They should be constantly giving it over. They should be really respectful of clients' knowledge of themselves. Now, granted, somebody who comes in and doesn't have a lot of experience, a lot of knowledge in therapy, maybe they don't have that level of expertise, but still the therapist can be constantly educating the client, can be sharing, can be treating it as a real relationship, not as a role play where someone sits in a chair and knows better.
Yeah. Yeah, it's, I mean, when you think about a therapist really embracing their power over a client, that just in my mind, I can just picture, the wounded child who didn't have any say in with their parents, and they're admonishing their client as though it's their parents sitting there in front of them, and they're taking that anger and stuff out on the client, and they don't even see that they're doing it.
Yeah, yeah. And you want reparative quasi-parental role in the therapist, not re-traumatizing. And again, in my experience, like I've had out of maybe 20 therapists altogether in my life, 3 who I consider really, really good, and a few who've been neutral, and most have been not okay.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think, from my experience, is that people who pursue therapy degrees or who want to do therapy as a career is because they have their own trauma, and that's how they get interested in wanting to repair and heal and understand the workings of the mind. Certainly, that's my experience. It's in my case, like I was reading Holocaust book after Holocaust book when I was 8 years old. I'm not even Jewish, but I was trying to understand the mind of a person who would purposely torment millions of people because I had been purposely tormented in my life. I was trying to understand the workings of the mind of that kind of
Uh-huh.
person. And so I study and study, and that's how I became interested in it. And I think that's often the case. And if traditional therapy, talk therapy, is the only modality a person like that has experienced, they just don't really get all of the sides of their shadow. Like there's so much of our shadow that we can't see through just traditional therapy.
Yeah, yeah. And I think the other thing that is a huge problem in the therapy world is a kind of narrow focus on the modality that the person is trained in. And so they may be psychoanalytically oriented and therefore know nothing about EMDR, as an example. Um, they may be Jungian and they may know nothing about the Freudian approach. I mean, not that I think the world of Freud, but um, I think it's really important for therapists to have a broad knowledge of different modalities, not necessarily be certified or trained, but be aware, be knowledgeable, be able to say, you know what, things aren't working here. Maybe you should supplement this treatment with something else, or maybe you should be working in a different modality. Um, and again, I mean, I think that in my experience as a client, I've had to be the one who says this isn't working,
Yeah,
and that can be really hard,
yeah,
and it can be really hard to move on from a relationship where there's a dependence that's been fostered.
absolutely.
And so I think the therapists need to be really mindful of, we're stuck and I don't know what to do and I can't help it, and own that.
Hmm.
Most of them won't.
It's not a personal failure. It's about the client and what the client needs and the way
Yeah.
that their mind and body work.
I mean, another personal example, I was in, this was a very, very traditional psychoanalysis. So I was on the couch and I was going daily. And I was, my first marriage was falling apart. I was badly depressed and asked a few times about going on antidepressants. This was in the listening to Prozac era. And he kept saying, no, I don't think that's a good idea. No, I don't think that's a good idea. Eventually I started feeling that the couch and his very Freudian removed stance was more traumatizing than helpful. And he's like, well, we can take it off of the couch. And we took it off of the couch and it got no better. And I left and I went to another therapist and went on antidepressants. Initially had a lot of benefits from it. And I was on them for about 3 years. I went back to him and I said, I just want you to apologize because you kept telling me not to do antidepressants and they really saved my life. And they did at the time. And he would not apologize. He
Mm.
just said, I don't think they were indicated in your case. Maybe he was afraid of malpractice. I don't know. But it's just, that's kind of encapsulates like that authority role, the unwillingness to yield any power, the unwillingness to acknowledge mistakes. And I think in my experience, it's pervasive in the therapy world. It's tragic, and part of what why I wanted to do the paper was like, hey, we all can do better than this.
Yeah, and it's really important for the client to understand that they have intuition and they have um, a sense of what they need. And if therapists will not yield, that, there's so much stigma. I mean, even still, like, stigma is less around getting therapy, a lot less than it was in the 50s. Um, Back then, they saw it as a personal failure or a defect. There was something wrong with you if you needed to go to therapy. We're more aware now that pretty much everybody needs therapy, but there's still a lot of stigma in culture, and I think even more among men,
Oh,
from what I've
absolutely. I was
seen.
just going to say, like for men, I think it's still really, really in many sectors a taboo.
Yeah, yes. And so when those individuals go and they either are forced into therapy or they start exploring the possibility, they don't feel empowered necessarily. They might feel like they have to just believe everything that they're being told, or on the other hand, they could be very combative and really resistant to anything. And so it's just it's important that everybody know that you are your own authority, and anyone that you hire to help you is there to help you, but they are not in charge of you and they are not the decision maker in your life.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that's again, kind of a key point is that they work for you.
Yeah,
And I don't think people, I mean, for myself, I don't, I've not always been aware enough of that fact. And if it's really not serving you, you're not obligated to continue.
yeah. And I've certainly struggled in my life with feeling like I need permission from other people. I grew up Jehovah's Witness, and it's very strict, controlling. And then my
Mhm.
mom is very fearful. I mean, if you're in that religion, you're going to be a very, very fearful person. And so she was always trying to make sure, like, I didn't go anywhere or do anything. She didn't want me to get hurt. And it's so just this sense of being followed around and evaluated and not having privacy and not having permission to do anything. I've, carried into my adult life, and am just now unraveling and recognizing that just because someone makes a request doesn't mean I'm obligated to meet it and drop everything I'm doing right here, right now, and rush over to please that person. And if you're a person who grew up with a very controlling parent or in a very controlling religion or a very controlling culture, which many cultures are, um, you might be struggling with that kind of with your own sense of it's me who needs to give permission for my life, for what I'm doing, for what I want. Not, I don't need to go look for it out there. I don't need to get everybody else's opinion and input, and I don't need to put myself out there for evaluation. That's not always, helpful. So, and especially a person like me, very analytical. Traditional analytical therapy is not what I need. I need to test it because I already have too much of that going on in my own head.
Mm-hmm. I'm very fortunate in that although there was this controlling aspect in my upbringing, I had a tremendous amount of freedom as well. And I mean, I have a better ability to be my own advocate than a lot of people do. Um, and I think with some of what's happened in this recent therapeutic process, and one of the biggest revelations was doing the adult attachment interview and discovering that my fundamental attachment style is secure. That came as a kind of a shock because there is a lot of trauma in my history, and there was this element of control in my mother's way of being. At the same time, I can, I'm now sort of in this process of rewriting my childhood narrative and seeing how incredible it was in many ways and how much really good stuff was given to me that enabled me to be, not fully and not without a lot of struggle, but to be my own advocate in a way that I think a lot of people don't have the ability. I mean, standing up to that therapist is one, those the couple of therapists that I mentioned is, those are examples of it. That there are others, and I hadn't really until recently understood that as signs of how good my parents were in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
That's been an outgrowth of the recent course of therapy.
Yeah, and that's a really important one because we want to move our focus eventually to from the pain to the strengths. Like when you're looking at Chiron, if you're talking about astrology, the wounded healer, like sometimes your greatest wound becomes your greatest strength, and there's all this gold there, like you had mentioned about that very painful acid journey, very long. Like there's gold in there, and once you actually feel and process the pain of it, then you are able to look beyond that and feel and process the good in it too. And I as well, was definitely taught to think for myself and not to just trust external authority implicitly. So it's very interesting how I was in this very strict religion that we completely trusted them as the authority. They were the way and the only way. But on the other hand, my dad had been um, he had done a lot of acid in his younger years, and he had left the Navy, and he had gone to Vietnam, and he didn't like the military industrial complex and the way that the government interacts with the weapons manufacturers to profit using taxpayer dollars, and so he was always talking about all of those things and teaching me that you don't just take people's word for it. So being able to, I can stand up and speak in front of people without much difficulty from being in that religion. Like we were put on stage and we had to go door to door, and it was absolutely the worst, most miserable thing as a kid because it was humiliating. But then having the skills to just be able to speak or to stand up to a terrible boss or to quietly leave something if it just isn't working for me. If I don't have the balls to stand up to somebody, because I'm certainly a conflict avoider, I'll still quietly leave.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, there.
Well, I think you're touching on something that's important, and it's a concern that I have, and I touch on some of this in the paper. The way that trauma is being sort of centered in the last 10 to 15 years. I think there's a really problematic side to it that isn't talked about enough. And that is that we can get so focused on trauma as defining that we lose sight of the fact that many people who are traumatized, have other strengths that that are really reparative. And if we're just going down the trauma path and we identify ourselves with the trauma, just identifying ourselves with neurodivergence, I'm very troubled by that. Like that I acknowledge that I'm neurodivergent, but I don't even like the term. I prefer outlier. I guess your dog doesn't.
That's so great.
uh, I think
Sure.
I think that defining ourselves by medical terms and conditions is there's a big risk and a big downside to that, because
I
then that can become all we are in our own minds.
absolutely, yeah. I hear people use the term neurodivergent often, and I'm like, so you think differently? Isn't that a gift? Like, you know, my mom has this tendency to diagnose. I think she's kind of stopped doing that, but there was a period of time in her life where she was diagnosing everybody with bipolar disorder. Anybody who kind of hurt her, if they said something, that was kind of hurtful, or they were a little too brusque with her, or it would just be like, oh, that person's bipolar. And then, later it was, oh, that person is just, I think she told me one time, I think you have Asperger's. I'm like, okay, well, whatever I have, I don't care. Like, you don't like the way that I said that. I understand, like, but it would never come to that. It would never come to, I don't like the way you talk to me. Will you apologize? It would just be a diagnosis. And she's not a therapist or a doctor, but she does a lot of reading. She's done a lot of research, and she gets very familiar with these ideas. But
Yeah,
um, it's an interesting way to dismiss when someone has hurt you and to avoid confronting it. And
yeah. I mean, I think the narcissism label is another one that now is like ubiquitous. And there's a wonderful book by Kristen Dombeck about the history of narcissism and how it comes from Freud, and Freud used it to apply to women and gay men primarily, and traits that were associated with narcissism into probably the 1960s were in that category. Now it's been flipped on its head culturally, and it's almost always a term that's applied to cisgender heterosexual males.
yeah,
And it's used so freely without a real understanding of what it even means. And it just means this guy was a jerk, you know.
right,
And I mean, I went through a period where during the marital crisis where I was constantly examining, am I a narcissist? Am I a narcissist? And, I have narcissistic traits. We all do. And they're actually good.
yeah,
You know, we would die without some measure of narcissism. But now it's this like label that gets slapped around. I hear people do it a lot. And it's a medical, to the extent that it has any accuracy, which I'm skeptical of, as generally, it's a clinical term. The DSM, which is not a medical document, is where it's found. Know your DSM before you start throwing it around, and then question the DSM.
yeah.
So,
I mean, question everything, because
yeah,
everything is being made up by humans. All of our body of knowledge is stuff that we've made up. Even the scientific method it is not objective. It is biased. We have a question and we are leaning toward a certain answer to that question, and we apply different conditions to kind of get the outcome we're hoping to get. And we like to pretend we're not doing that, but we are doing that.
yeah,
And My friend Angela, she cracks me up because she says, all babies are narcissists. And it's like, yes, because if they didn't scream and cry when their needs weren't getting met, they would die. So we are all narcissistic. We have to be. That's how we survive. That's how our amygdala keeps our bodies alive and functioning, making sure we're eating, making sure we're not jumping off cliffs, in a bad situation. But uh, to any time that I just don't use the term. I don't use the term because anytime that I'm about to use it, I know that I need to shine it back on me. Okay, how am I being narcissistic? Because life is a mirror. If a person is treating me really badly, then I can either ask myself the question, okay, where have I treated other people that way? Or where am I treating myself that way? And because that's why I'm seeing that behavior in somebody else. It is not external. And so many, like, you have women who are in really abusive relationships where they're actually being beaten and they need to get out of the situation for sure. But what you find when you're that woman, because I've been that woman, is that you keep getting into that relationship. And there's a reason for that. It's not because you attract bad men, it's because internally there's narcissism happening against yourself and therefore against other people. And the only way to avoid continuously getting, sorry, my computer is starting to continuously finding yourself in relationships where narcissism is present is to look at your own and and work with it and feel the pain and the grief and the rage that you need to feel and allow it to be present within you and get out of denial and then start building a better relationship with yourself. Okay, I got my charger plugged in. Sorry about that. Well, oh, I guess we're at time. So tell
Yeah,
us where we can find your paper and where we can find your works, and we'll include the links in the show notes.
great. The website is markamichaels.com, and the link to the preprint is right at the main page. And I really invite people to click on that and then read the full preprint. And hopefully within next year or so, it will actually be peer reviewed and formally published. But the basic paper is out there. We didn't get into the AI component of it, but that's a whole other dimension that I think people find really interesting.
Okay, well, let's schedule another time to talk about that.
Okay.
All right. So awesome to meet you and talk with you today. Thank you for being here.
Thanks very much.
If there's
Have a great.
anything you want to leave the audience with before we go ahead and.
Just read the paper, and if you're in therapy, be mindful and take charge.
Beautiful. Thank you so much.
Thank
Have a
you.
great
Have a
day.
great afternoon.
You too. Bye.
Bye-bye.